Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another lesson on life during the time of the Stuarts in England. In the current situation, I think we are all more than aware of what diseases can do and how they can affect a society. After all, we have all been forced to remain in our houses for the past 2 months. So today we are going to look at a similar situation that happened 400 years ago, more or less, and we're looking at the last big plague epidemic in British history, the Great Plague of 1665 and 1666. In particular, we'll tackle the following points. First, what is the difference between epidemic, pandemic, and endemic? Then we'll look at what was the Great Plague, why it was so deadly, and why it is important. And finally, I will give you a model answer. Now, the model answer will actually be in the transcript. I will not read it out loud. So, epidemic, pandemic, and endemic. What is the difference? Now, before we start talking about the plague, we need to learn three words: epidemic, pandemic, and endemic. They all sound very similar because they all end in demic, which is connected to the ancient Greek word demos, meaning people or population. Like the word democracy, which also comes from demos, people, and kratos, power, and means power to the people. So, the word epidemic means disease outbreak, okay? It's when a disease affects a large number of people. It comes from epi, which means upon, above, and demos. So it's something that happens upon a population. Epidemos, epidemic. Some epidemics can be global and can affect the entire world. This is why they're called pandemics, which comes from the ancient Greek word pan, which means everyone, and demos, of course, population, so the entire population. Pandemics, like the one that we are living right now, are disease outbreaks that affect the entire world. So what is going on in Britain right now is very similar to what's going on in India or in Italy or in the United States. Okay, it's a disease outbreaks that affects the entire world. Finally, some diseases just won't go away. They remain endemic. Okay, the word endemic comes from en, which is the Greek word for in, and demos, meaning population. So they are in the population. And it refers to diseases like the plague in the Middle Ages, which appeared, did the damage, then disappeared for a while, and then came back again after about 10 years or so. Okay, and then they disappeared, and then they came back again. That is an endemic disease. Moving on. Let's talk about the Great Plague. Okay, what was the Great Plague? The plague is a disease that is carried by the bacteria that live in the stomach of fleas. Fleas then bite the rats who move around humans and allow the fleas to bite humans and spread the disease. There is a very nice picture in the transcript which explains it. So, the rat carries the plague bacteria. The fleas drink from the rat's blood. Then the fleas jumps from the rats to the humans. They bite the human gets infected and dies, essentially. So once a person was bit by a plague-carrying flea, they would almost certainly catch the disease. The plague would then cause fever in the infected person, okay? And that was one of the symptoms, fever. The disease is also called the bubonic plague, since the infected people would also develop buboes, which are like big lumps of swollen flesh that developed in the body. They're filled with pus and they are generally very painful. So fever and buboes were the two main symptoms. But sometimes, in the worst cases, the unfortunate infected person would also get pneumonia, a disease of the lungs. In this case, we're talking about pneumonic plague, in which you not only have fever and buboes and everything, but also your lungs just collapse. It's not very good. In any case, between half and the majority of the population who caught the disease died. And this gives you the idea of how much deadly and terrible the plague could be. But was it deadly just because it was a deadly disease? Yes and no. Now, today we know that the plague is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, and that it can be treated with antibiotics and other modern medicine. However, at the time they did not know anything about germs and bacteria. Instead, they thought that disease was caused by a bad smell called miasma. Therefore, they did not take measures that could reduce the infections by making the environment cleaner, for example. Because, dirty environments, a dirty desk, a dirty operating table are full of bacteria. But if you don't know that bacteria are around, that bacteria are a thing, and that they carry disease, then you don't clean up. Then you have no reason to be as clean as we are today in medicine. Okay? Instead of cleaning up, let's say, they try to make the smell of everything around them more pleasant. But we will go into detail about it in the next lesson when we will discuss how people dealt with the plague, okay? How they tried to make the disease disappear. Unfortunately, it did not work. So for this reason, for the lack of hygiene caused by the fact that they did not know about bacteria and germs, the plague was incredibly deadly, okay, and it was able to kill more than 250,000 people in less than 1 year. To compare now, the COVID pandemic has killed around 30,000 people, which is a lot, which is huge, but is nowhere near the plague. Still, I don't want to look like I'm reducing. This current situation right now is huge. So, why is the plague important? Now, the Great Plague of 1665 is important for mainly two reasons. It killed a lot of people, at least, as we said, 250,000 in less than 12 months. And then it was the last outbreak of the plague in Great Britain and the last major plague epidemic in Western Europe. There were others, but they were not as big. Now, it was not as bad as other epidemics or pandemics. The disease had become endemic. The plague had existed for at least 300 years. It had been around for centuries. It appeared, it did its damage, and then disappeared, and then came back in about 10 or 15 years. This is what endemic means, okay? And so the population was used to it. They knew, okay, it's been around 15 years since the last outbreak of the plague. Might as well get prepared in a way, might as well start isolating or be mentally prepared to the fact that we are going to be the victim of another wave of the plague. So people were used to it. And even though they didn't know about bacteria, there were still ways they used to cope with it that made sense. And so they were prepared. And also, unlike what happened in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages there was a huge plague pandemic called the Black Death, which made millions and millions of victims, okay, which had millions and millions of dead people. We're talking about half of the European population, and it caused a huge change in the way people lived, in the way people thought, in the way people worked. However, the plague we are talking about now, the one that happened in 1665, did not change much because the people were already used to it, okay? And maybe this is the important thing to consider, the fact that after a while certain diseases sort of become normal and they stop having the impact that they had the first time they arrive. So, those were more or less the facts. I tried to keep it vague. Now, I would like you to answer the question, what was the Great Plague? So if you want to reach a bronze level, you have to describe the Great Plague and its symptoms and tell me what were the main symptoms of the plague, the buboes and the fever. Then for the silver level, you also have to explain the symptoms and explain why the plague was so deadly by telling me that because people misdiagnosed or misunderstood the reasons why the plague happened in the first place, because they didn't know about germs and so on. And finally, for a gold answer, you also have to tell me why it was important, if it was important. Okay, I'm looking forward to read your answers and see you next time.